George Will is here. He is a columnist for the Washington Post Writers Group and a contributing editor of Newsweek magazine. In 1976, he won a Pulitzer Prize for commentary. His seventh collection of essays is called With a Happy Eye, But America and the World, 1997 to 2002. I am pleased to have him back at this table. Welcome, sir.
Glad to be with you.
Great to have you here. Now, what do you just put these together occasionally, sort of go back through them and organize them?
About every 5 years.
Yeah.
Discard 4 out of 5, keep ones that are on, I think, lasting principles of involving recurring issues of our time.
Is a column your best? I mean, what's your best length?
I think I probably dream in 750-word chunks. You know, you get to the end and you stop.
Yes, that's right.
It's a very exacting discipline.
Yeah, it is.
Pascal once said to someone he was corresponding with, said, "Sorry about the long letter. I didn't have time to write a short one."
Yes,
it's harder
exactly
to write short.
Yeah.
I wrote a doctoral dissertation. It's about 500 pages long, great sprawling, undisciplined glob. And,
on what subject?
Tolerance. I said there was too much of it going around. It was on the First Amendment and stuff like that.
Let me move to the defining time for George Bush, President, number 43. Why do you believe it's necessary now?
Because we have waited 11 years. In the instruments of surrender after the Gulf War, the Iraqi regime was given 15 days to comply with revealing what weapons of mass destruction they had and to begin the UN-supervised destruction thereof. Well, more than about 4,400 days have passed since then. We know this. There's a critical mass of forces have come together in this one man, a recidivist liar, a sociopath, and a war criminal. He's fired ballistic missiles at 4 countries near him. He launched one of the bloodiest wars since 1945 against Iran. He's used these weapons of mass destruction against his own people. He has been willing to forego $180 billion of oil revenues to pursue accepting the sanctions rather than allow weapons inspectors in. So we know he has hegemonic designs, an insatiable appetite for astonishingly dangerous weapons. I mean, some of them. I mean, one of the biological weapons he has is a fungus, the primary role of which would be to cause an outbreak, a mass outbreak of liver cancer in children. Now, that is a unique approach to war.
It is said that he didn't use these weapons during the Gulf War, especially against Israel, because he feared a nuclear attack against Baghdad. Certain death.
Well, I don't know if I can't read his mind.
I know I can't either, but I mean, that argument is made which would suggest that deterrence has an impact on him.
Deterrence may have an impact on him, but what happens if one of these agents gets loose in the city of New York in the ventilating system of a skyscraper, and you can't find his fingerprints on it? The only safe response to people who cannot be deterred, who are suicidal, such as Al-Qaeda, or those who can operate through such people, is to go and get them before they come to us.
I'm presenting you with a parade of arguments that you have heard before and discussed before, and the president addressed some of them. One is we assume, and I assume you are, that he is sui generis, that this is in fact a one-of-a-kind on the face of the planet.
No, I don't think that he is. I think he, combined with the combination of forces I just described, is quite unique.
Okay. Maybe people as evil as he is or more evil, but he has the weapons that make him different and one of a kind. Secondly, what risk is there that if under attack he will use everything at his disposal, thinking that he's going down with the ship?
It's called the Samson option. You bring down the temple around you.
Yes.
Israel worries about this. Israel is the likely target. Israel supports the United States,
right,
which tells you something about their sense of the dangers.
But I talked to an Israeli general this week who said the following to me: I don't worry about what they may attack. We're not worried as much about an attack against us as we are worried about the destabilizing of either Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and other Arab countries, Jordan specifically.
To which I would respond, what is so wonderful about the stability of Egypt?
It depends on who follows Mubarak. Mubarak could very well be better than what follows him.
Well, in 1944, we went ashore in Normandy to destabilize Europe. Hitler stabilized Europe.
Yeah.
Well, we don't
But
want
you're
that
not
kind of
comparing
stability.
Mubarak to Hitler. I mean, that's a
No,
stretch.
I'm not, except, by the way, that he has a medieval cum Nazi anti-Semitism permeates his press.
And intellectualism.
Oh, I mean, it's just, but look, it is in the United States' interest, it is in the interest of 99.9% of the people in the Middle East to bring modernity to that culture. That's the great fight, is not between them and the United States. It's between the modernized, the Islamic world.
Right.
It's between those in the Islamic world who want to modernize and those who don't.
And you put people like the royal family in Saudi Arabia among those who don't. Do you put the royal family in Jordan among those who don't want to modernize? Because that's clearly not true.
No, that's certainly not true. No, indeed, I'm sure that the royal family of Jordan would like to have some company, some more civilized regimes around them. And it does seem to me that the way to break the ice that has frozen these people, you know, we've had a wave of democratization from Southeast Asia all over Latin America. What's been exempt? There are 22.
We just saw it in action in Brazil, didn't we?
There are, well, you know, democracy's messy.
Exactly.
That's the way it goes. But there are 22 if you count the Palestine Authority, government entities in this so-called Arab world, not one democracy. Very few, Sakharovs and Solzhenitsyns even, those great noble dissidents.
But in an interesting way, there's the beginning of a democracy in Iran.
Precisely. Iran is a
not an Arab country.
Very interesting case, because Iran is a place where the regime hates us and the public likes us.
You and I talk to the same people like Bernard Lewis.
Exactly.
Whose argument has been consistently.
Absolutely.
Who also believes, as you do maybe, that the establishment of a democracy in Iraq is critically important. Now, here is my question. Is it because they want to use that to democratize all these other countries, or simply because they think, you know, the United States would do well to have a place that could be, you know, a laboratory? I think
the answer is that we believe, with reason, that democracy is infectious. We've seen it. We saw it happen in Eastern Europe. There was just, people reached a critical mass of mendacity under those regimes of the East Bloc, and it exploded. And I do believe that you will see a ripple effect, a happy domino effect, if you will, of democracy knocking over these medieval tyrannies.
So if we can establish a democracy in Iraq, it may very well bring a democracy to Saudi Arabia, notwithstanding what that democracy might look like. We trust the people. And in Egypt,
I certainly trust the people more than I trust that terrorist-supporting regime.
In Saudi Arabia.
Absolutely.
Notwithstanding what kind of friendship they have exhibited over the years with the United States, and also the sort of exchange of support for oil.
Notwithstanding.
You take your chances.
Absolutely.
And if necessary.
Condoleezza Rice is quite right. She says there's an enormous condescension in saying that somehow the Arab world is just not up to democracy.
No,
and there's an enormous ahistorical error when people say, well, we can't go into war with Iraq until we know what post-war Iraq's going to look like.
Yeah.
In 1942, a year after Pearl Harbor.
Year of my birth.
A year after Pearl Harbor, did we have a clear idea what we were going to do with post-war Germany?
No.
With post-war Japan?
No.
Of course not. We made it up as we went along, and we did a very good job.
You know what we benefited from? We benefited, first of all, from a far-reaching president in that case, Harry Truman, you know, and we also benefited from George Marshall, and we benefited from very strong individuals. And also...
And I think we have the finest national security team since Truman.
Okay, but let me finish my thought.
Go ahead.
We also benefited from a very, very strong bipartisan Congress with all the people that you know, from Vandenberg and across, right?
That's right. But I think, I think there's much more bipartisanship than meets the eye. In these arguments between the president and his so-called critics, the critics are really pretty muted. This is what's been called the narcissism of small differences. I mean, Al Gore has given a speech criticizing. Can you tell me what Al Gore's position is?
Yes, I can, but I don't think it's so significant. I mean, the interesting thing about that...
He says what Ted Kennedy says, Saddam Hussein's intolerable, has to disarm or go.
Right.
I mean, this is a fairly small difference.
Yeah, exactly. But it basically says that we shouldn't be distracted by a war against Iraq, is what he says. We ought to focus first on Al Qaeda and finish the war against terrorism.
And
that's what he said.
And before that, the same people said we shouldn't focus on Iraq until we settle the Palestinian-Israeli dispute. There's always something to say ought to come first if you really don't want to do it.
Where do you think that stands, a Palestinian-Israeli dispute? And if you were a Palestinian, do you think that it is now been clearly proven that you ought to change the Palestinian
regime
Authority.
Change.
Yes,
Look,
that's where the regime change.
The Palestinian people were the worst-led people of the 20th century, and that's saying something.
Yeah.
In 1914, in World War I, they supported the Ottoman Empire and lost. World War II, they supported Hitler and lost. Cold War, they supported the Soviet Union and lost. In the Gulf War, they supported Saddam Hussein and lost. Aren't they tired of this? It is time for better leaders, and they're going to have to do something to save themselves.
Yeah, but it's not our place to choose those leaders at all.
That's right, but it is our place.
Or Sharon's place.
It is our place to tell them there's a severe price to be paid for following people of whom Abba even once said, the Palestinian leadership never misses an opportunity for missing an opportunity.
A very gifted man, and that's the most eloquent thing that people remember him as having said. But you think it has no consequences in terms of the war against Iraq?
None.
Has no consequences for our relationships within the Middle East community and on the conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis?
I really don't. Have any nations mobilized militarily to support Arafat? No. We've been said, it's always said, watch out, the Arab street will rise up in support of Arafat. Doesn't happen. People of the Middle East know that the Jordanian government in 1970, under the late King Hussein, probably killed in one September, Black September, killed more Palestinian fighters than Israel has killed in 50 years. The bloodiest war in the Middle East, far and away, was Iran-Iraq war. It had nothing to do with the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. So the Middle East is perfectly capable of being a cauldron and a bloodbath without blaming the Israelis or that dispute.
I realize you're not a military strategist. Do you think this will be a quick and easy conflict if it comes to that?
Fairly quick, yes.
Do you really?
I do.
Because
their military is probably a third of what it was. Our military is probably twice what it was in 1991. He cannot engage us in the desert because our precision weapons now and our bombing and our drones spotting the targets are much too
and probably doesn't want to. He learned his lesson in the Gulf War.
There is every reason to believe that there will be a weakness in the chain of command by which he controls his forces. One of the interesting lines used first by Don Rumsfeld in congressional testimony and then last night in Cincinnati by President Bush when he said, officers in the Iraqi army will be wise not to obey orders to use weapons of mass destruction. Through the public airways, and I'm sure surreptitiously, we are communicating to the Iraqi military that a Nuremberg defense, that is, I was only obeying orders, won't work. We are saying that they will be adjudged war criminals, and to bear that in mind.
Do you think they're
this is part of, well, I do. This is part of the psychological warfare operations of a war that has already started, I believe.
How do you measure our success in, and again, this does not suggest an indictment of the fact that we did it. How do you measure our success in nation building in Afghanistan?
It's to put it mildly, a work in progress.
Yes,
and the president,
a difficult work
the
in
president,
process.
I think, admits this. This was part of his education as president, is to say that his hostility to nation building was radically revised when he saw what a failed nation, Afghanistan, a vacuum, gets filled with. Political nature abhors a vacuum, and when it fills up with the Taliban and the leakage of violence to these private groups, essentially, like Al-Qaeda, then you have to say, well, I revise that. We're going to have to get into the nation-building business.
So if we're in the nation-building business in Afghanistan, we may be in the nation-building business in Iraq.
That's
Where
different
else?
in Iraq. It's different in Iraq because Iraq is a big, rich country with a middle class, with universities.
And these are not warlords. They are of a different nature in terms
Correct.
of what causes their conflict among them.
Correct.
Nevertheless, they are in conflict. There is no single, strong opposition force.
That's true.
As they had in the north in Afghanistan.
That's true.
And in the south.
But, you know, regime change didn't just arise as a subject recently. We did it in Grenada, Panama, Serbia. Would the world be better off if Milosevic were back in Serbia?
No, but what's
Noriega in Panama?
But should we live in a world in which there's some respect for, it is argued, some respect for international law?
Yes.
And we should.
Absolutely.
And therefore, where do you draw the line, and what is the standard when America engages in some kind of preemptive action,
or
as it did in Panama, as it did
or as the doctrine is called 400 years ago, anticipatory self-defense. Elizabeth I, and thinking that there was indeed an armada heading her way, sent out the British Navy to preemptively attack Spanish ships in Portuguese and Spanish harbors. That's called preemptive attack. The most successful arms control measure of our lifetime was the Israeli attack on the Iraqi reactor in 1981. The Israelis were denounced for preemption, for unilateralism, and aren't we glad they did it?
We certainly are.
Because Kuwait today would be the 19th province of Iraq because they would have had nuclear weapons in 1991.
Okay, but I still come back to my point. That makes a very good case that there are times in which we would be better off if there was some kind of preemptive action. Yes. I still look for what's the standard for determining what's appropriate and not appropriate. Is there a Bush doctrine coming out of all this?
You know, you can't have general rules as you have in mathematics.
Okay, but you got to have some sense of...
Sure.
There is a sense, you got to say that with respect to any civilization, any society has to have a generally accepted code.
I understand, but this is not a code like a commercial code.
I know that, but it is code in terms of things that you think are necessary for the world to live in some degree of balance.
Relations between nations is a science of single instances, if you will, which is to say no science at all, because everything is always different. But again, we come back to the fact that what we have in Iraq is a unique critical mass, a unique constellation of dangers. The weapons, the man, the record.
Okay, then, as I think the President is saying, I don't see that kind of constellation of dangers anywhere else.
Correct.
Certainly not in Iran.
Correct.
Certainly not in North Korea.
Correct.
Although they were both nominated for the axis of evil.
I suspect, I can't prove this, but I suspect that North Korea was brought in for affirmative action. That is, so there'd be a non-Islamic nation in there.
I thought so too. You know, just to make sure that we're not talking about a clash of civilizations
exactly
here.
Right. Yep.
Is this a clash of civilizations?
No, the civilization...
Well, but stay with me. I don't mean the clash of Muslim versus Christian, Catholic, Christian or Judeo conflict. Is it in some way, though, a clash of civilizations between modernity and something else?
In that sense, yes. It's a clash of epochs. There's the modern epoch, and then there are these people frozen in the 14th century. And that's what has to be resolved. But it is not primarily a clash with the United States. It's a deep fissure, not deep enough, and not evenly divided enough yet, but a deep fissure within the Islamic world. And there's no doubt, none whatever, about the outcome. Modernity is going to come there.
Okay. You've heard all these before, but it's nice to hear you say them on this program. Why haven't we generated more support for an argument that you believe is so easy to make?
Well, first of all, the support we've got: Israel, the United States, Britain, Turkey, Italy, Spain. That's not chopped liver. That's a pretty good chunk of the civilized world. True, we don't have some members of the...
Three, for example.
Well,
France.
Yeah, France.
Russia. China.
Yeah, well, China, the authors of the Tiananmen Square massacre, we can go ahead without their moral benediction, I think.
They may be pleased by this because, you know, they could say, here comes Taiwan, and, you know, it's the idea of...
I don't think so. No, it does seem to me...
That's called
the question
that's
really...
called self-defense.
The question really comes down to why Europe is behaving this way. Well, that's partly because, it seems to me, Europe is today, wants to think of itself as a political expression, and it is still a geographic expression. They don't have an army. They haven't been able to discipline themselves to create the real sinews of projecting power in the world. And therefore, they are content to posture and moralize. Well, the world is not run by posturing and moralizing. At the end of the day, rhetoric and diplomacy without the sword is in vain. And we have the sword. And there's a certain envy, palpable envy, on the part of European elites that the United States is at the wheel and they're not. And therefore, there is an attempt to rein in the United States, not because they
well, where is that coming from? I mean, clearly you're saying it's not Britain, and clearly you're saying it's not Italy because of Berlusconi and Blair.
That's right.
I mean, is it only France you're talking about, or are you talking about France and Germany?
France and Germany.
And I'm not sure where the Germans stand, because Schroeder used that much more as a political survival tactic rather than some... and Germany may be different also because they have a history of of anti-war fever there.
When don't have a history of war fever.
Yeah,
the idea of a war without Germany is something I can live with.
No involvement, no presence, nothing,
right.
just on the sidelines,
right.
like Switzerland.
Exactly right.
George Bush, tell me what you see in him and how you see him different today than the man who ran for president in some 2.5 years ago.
He's extraordinarily comfortable in his own skin. And the most amazing thing to me, Charlie, is this. Someone said to me 2 years ago that George Bush would not only achieve a connection with the American people that I think only 2 other post-war presidents have had, Eisenhower and Reagan, but that he would achieve it by his rhetoric. I would have been dumbfounded because
it says something about the power of speechwriter.
Well, no, because...
It does.
Well,
George Bush is not...
Let me explain why. Now, you're right. He has one of the most brilliant speechwriters in our history, Mr. Gerson.
Right.
But it's not just when he's delivering these set speeches, as in Cincinnati, the UN, West Point, Citadel, Berlin, the ones that have shaped his doctrine. But it's when he's out there leaning on a lectern, talking to a bunch of carpenters in Pittsburgh, that he does have a connection that seems to me quite striking, which is why his post-September 11 job approval rating is much higher and more durably high than Franklin Roosevelt's was after Pearl Harbor, which is why perhaps Senator Cleveland, who doesn't Max Cleveland of Georgia, who doesn't have a record of supporting the Bush administration, has supported the president's war resolution, knowing as he does that Mr. Cleveland, is up for election, and George Bush's approval rating in Georgia is 71%.
Tom Daschle said over the weekend that he will probably end up supporting the president. The only person I know specifically, 2 people I know specifically have said they would not support it as it stands today, the resolution, is Ted Kennedy. I heard him say it. And Paul Wellstone may have said it. I'm not sure. I would assume he might have as well. I mean, this thing's going to pass with at least 70 votes, don't you think?
Oh, much more than that, sure.
90?
That's right. No, Mr. Daschle wants many things, but most of all, he wants to change the subject. He wants to have the remaining days of this election. There are, about 27 days between now and election day. He wants it to be on what the Democrats consider their issues: prescription drugs, Patients' Bill of Rights,
deficits,
all that stuff. Yeah. And time's a wasting, Charlie, because the election started. There are all kinds of states, more and more, are going to early voting. Anyone can get an absentee ballot. You can vote online. The election's underway in a great many states, and still the subject hasn't been changed. Small wonder Mr. Daschle will do anything to get this subject behind him.
Well, I mean, that may very well be true, but I mean, I think he obviously may feel strongly that, in fact, in the end, as long as he's made his points, whether you think they're right or not, about the nature of the regime after Saddam or the nature of the place after Saddam or feeling that it would be better. Don't you agree that it would be better to have UN support than not?
It would be marginally better to have
just marginally.
Just marginally.
Why do you say that?
Because what is the UN? Again, the General Assembly is nothing. The Security Council is a mirror, and its permanent membership is a frozen, broken mirror with a reflection of 1945 in it. Would you please tell me what France is doing there? India's not there. Indonesia, Brazil, the great nations that have emerged since then. And we have this picture of Potsdam Conference, practically. The UN is a very marginal, minor utility player.
So would you also like to see an abolition of the veto in the Security Council?
No, they can veto all they want. I just don't want undue respect given to their vetoes.
You really think it has no... would you like to see the UN abolished?
No.
So because what? You think that it's healthy to have some kind of debating society?
It can be useful, sure.
It can be useful.
It can be a useful arena. It has been at
But a
various
lot
points.
of people that you respect feel strongly. Brent Scowcroft being one, Jim Baker being another, George Bush 41. If you look at what they did in 1991, that it is in your interest to go and get international support. And it's better to have these other countries with you on the takeoff so that they can participate on the landing, to use an old, terrible cliche.
I couldn't agree more. But what I really get the president I adhere to on this is John Kennedy, who, when the Cuban Missile Crisis started, addressing the nation, says if we want to go international body, get international approval, but we're going to do this anyway. which means he was saying there's no veto here,
right,
and we're not paralyzed by indecision, and we're not uncertain of the virtue of our cause. We just like, we would like their opinion.
Do you think it is the same peril today from Saddam Hussein as it was from Cuban missiles in 1962?
It could be worse today because the Soviet Union did have a structure of command. We understood the Soviet Union did not want war. It took risks. It wanted the fruits of war, but it didn't want war. Our arsenal at that point in 1962 was so much greater than theirs. I mean, it was no contest who was going to win that showdown. The problem today is we could wake up tomorrow and Saddam Hussein could say, by the way, I have a nuclear weapon, and by the way, I've delivered it. It is somewhere in some great American city. I'm not going to tell you where, of course, but I can detonate it when I wish. Then what do we do? And he's just the kind of guy to do it. Do we have any doubt?
Does he have the ability to do it?
I don't know, and I don't want to wait to find out when he proves it. As the president has often said, we don't want, and said last night, we don't want the smoking gun to issue a mushroom cloud, and as Don Rumsfeld has said, a smoking gun only smokes after it has been fired.
What do you think of the Secretary of State?
I think he's a man devoted
knowing
to
what you have written,
devoted to avoiding war, which is a virtue, particularly in a Secretary of State.
or particularly in a general.
I think that's true. I think every president has three implacable adversaries: the press, the Congress, and the State Department. And I mean that.
And why the State Department?
I think because there is an Arabist bent to it, if only because there are 21 or 22 embassy jobs open in the Arab world and only one should be in Jerusalem. It's in Tel Aviv, our embassy. I do believe that the State Department has far too many holdovers from previous administrations. I believe the State Department is full of people who do not support the president's policies and do not wish him to be reelected.
Who is your intellectual hero? Intellectual hero.
Of all time?
Yeah.
In our country, John Marshall, and
really, the founder, really, of the modern Supreme Court.
38 years as Chief Justice, the maker of our nation.
Yeah. Are you a Hamiltonian man?
More Hamiltonian than Jefferson.
How about more Hamiltonian than Franklin?
Probably.
Probably.
But Franklin died just as the formative era was coming. But
a couple of new biographies have come out about him. One from Edwin Morgan up at Yale, and also Walter Isaacson down at CNN.
Yep.
But in the end, the greatest American of all was George Washington.
I agree with that. We were having an argument about this the other night, and I came down. I grew up again in Lincoln Country.
Yes.
And he's the second greatest, but the second greatest. The indispensable man was Washington. Now, I know de Gaulle once said the graveyards are full of indispensable men, but the fact is he was. No Washington, no United States of America as we know it.
And understood when to step aside in the interest of a greater country.
Exactly. The greatest thing he did was the yielding of power, because he could have kept it forever.
George Will has a new collection of columns called With a Happy Eye, But America and the World, 1997 to 2002. The most interesting thing about where we are in history is that it seems to me a critical moment in terms of where important decisions are being made that may very well shape the next 25 years for sure.
Absolutely.
You know, and they ought to be a very, very healthy debate about that. It's not just about Iraq, but it is
a healthy debate.
And it ought to be. I didn't say it wasn't. I said it ought to be. You know, and in a sense of what our role really ought to be, so that we understand, and also so that we exercise it as well and as wisely as we ought to.
Absolutely.
You know, and not arrogantly.
No, I think that's right. I think the president is convinced of two things. America is so powerful, more powerful than you can realize until you sit where he is, and for that reason, humility is in order.
Yeah, more powerful than it's ever been.
Absolutely. Nothing like it in terms of global supremacy since Rome.
It is an amazing time. Thank you, my friend. Great
Enjoyed
to see you.
it.
We'll be right back. Stay with us.